The leaders of the world's 7 advanced economies completed their in-person summit on June the 13th in Cornwall, England. A new initiative coming out of the meeting that has attracted a lot of attention is the Build Back Better World Plan, also known as the B3W. That is a massive infrastructure plan some say is meant to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. The introduction of the plan was held on the same day that the U.S. President Joe Biden was discussing strategic competition with China. To help us better understand the new initiative and other headlines from the summit, I'm joined by Professor Matveeva, a visiting senior research fellow from King's College London, and also by Professor Wang Yiwei of China's Renmin University. Welcome to you both. Professor Wang, let me go to you first. What's your rating of this joint communique, especially when you compare that to the 2019 joint communique from G7 and also the 2018 version?
I think the joint communique are much softer than the previous one because they cannot reach a consensus between the European countries with the United States. They need to deal with China jointly, but how to deal with they have different aspects. Particularly for President Macron even said that the G7 cannot be viewed as the bash-China or anti-China group. Also, most importantly, it's about a different future of the globalization. The Financial Times mentioned about from the Washington Consensus to Cornwall Consensus, the new liberalism consensus, internationalization finished. But how about the new how about the new globalization? The Europeans consider about the need diverse of the supply chain, not too much rely on the China. U.S. even want to decouple or de-Chinalize the global supply chain, so that's a dispute.
So that's really interesting, Cornwall consensus, in replacement or maybe, in complement to Washington consensus. So what's your vision of this Cornwall consensus, if there is one? I mean, what will be its relationship with Washington consensus? Would that be Washington consensus 2.0? Professor Wang.
The Washington consensus is capital-driven. It's more. There are two problems. The one is make China greater. China the water factory, catch up with the United States and the advanced economy, not just the quantity but even quality. Second is cause the problem with the rich and poor. The gap is so huge. So-called 1% of the people with the 90% of the wealth in the United States, so-called the Rust Belt, President Trump elected. So now President Biden's slogan is the working for the middle class. It's not a working for the rich people. So they also reached the consensus of so-called minimum tax of the global companies, 15%. So that's the different approach of the consensus, so-called.
And what about the role of China in these, consensuses, especially if there is a Cornwall consensus? Do you think China is a heightened threat, of course, a heightened perceived threat compared to Washington consensus 2 decades ago?
Well, now definitely the G7 want to undermine the Chinese position of the water factory. So that's the reason also China put forward the dual circulation strategy. China has keep the water factory position and also be the water market. So that's how to deal with China is still a big challenge for the G7 countries.
Anna, let me go to you. If you read this G7 Leader Summit from this year, 2021, China was mentioned at least 3 times. When the leaders talk about tracing the COVID-19 origin, when they talk about economic competition with China, and also allegations of human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and also the situation in East China Sea and South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, issues China concerns as its domestic affairs. What's your rating of the G7's leader statement?
It is very interesting. This is the first time we see President Biden making his mark on the world stage. And he needs to have some kind of framework, a global kind of framework for his presidency. So what he has been choosing so far is about competition between democratic and autocratic worlds, and of course with the message that in the end the democratic alternative which the G7 countries present is a more appealing, more attractive option, which is the world, majority of the world countries would follow. So China and Russia, they epistemize something which is of the opposite polar and something which should be seen as being in contestation with this kind of democratic world. So that's the framework. Then there is an issue how you actually fill the framework with issues, and what you put there, what you don't put, and you don't put things where you think you might engage in some cooperation, and there are ways in which, of course, Western industrialized nations and Japan are interested in cooperating with China, and some issues where they feel that there is, it's kind of safe to put them into contestation framework. And we see this kind of menu of issues, and that's where consensus between G7 leaders has been reached. Something has been in, something has been out.
And how do you see the follow-up of this statement? I mean, if you look at the 2018 and 2019 statement when Trump was in office, there was a statement. During some years there was not a statement. And then when Trump was voted out of office, Biden is in, there's a change in tones. How do you see, or envision the statement being followed up by these different countries?
There are two sides to it. One is that there is now far more consensus among G7 leaders. There is cautiously trust being restored among them. So it is more likely that they would converge around a common agenda, but at the same time being very mindful of their own interests, and they have their own relationships with large countries like China, like Russia, like others. Yeah. The other thing is that these countries, most of the time, they move quite slowly. If we are looking at big investment opportunities, if we are looking at some kind of democracy promotion through infrastructure, through aid, this type of projects take really decades. Yeah, especially if we are looking at collective action rather than unilateral action, for example, which China does, and for China it is easier to put words into action, because the road between decisions and execution is far shorter. Then what we don't know, how COVID situation would impact all these projects. We're in a very uncertain world. Now we can discuss plans as if we're coming out of the end of the pandemic. But that might be our wishful thinking. We might be looking at more developments and more unpredictable developments, which would require such a degree of international cooperation. Now this talk about competition maybe have to be kind of sidelined in the face of much bigger threats.
Right. Coming out of Chinese side, the Chinese embassy in the UK responded to the summit statement by saying that we always believe that countries, big or small, strong or weak, poor or rich, are equals, and that world affairs should be handled through consultation by all countries. The days when global decisions were dictated by a small group of countries are long gone. Professor Wang, your rating of this Chinese response to the G7?
Well, we definitely also need to think about the rule-based international order. Yes, that direction, but whose rules? What kind of rules? I think the universal rules is United Nations. International law is not just based on the so-called Western consensus, put as the universal consensus. That's not the fact. There's some new areas like the AI and the digital economy, which not have the international law or WTO rules, or we need to jointly with other developing countries to reach this consensus. If the Western countries think about human rights, I think that 80% of the world population they lived in the developing countries. So the people-oriented global governance principles that all the people, all the countries should jointly to set the rules and then follow that kind of route, not just in the name of other people follow the rule I put aside sometimes to unilaterally. So in the name of so-called the Western consensus actually is not the inclusive or the true multilateralism. The true multilateralism is the WTO-centric world trade and also United Nations-centric global consensus.
Right, out of this statement, a major piece of news, the G7 leaders said they will launch a new initiative, a massive infrastructure partnership called Build Back Better World, or B3W, that is, investing $40 trillion, 40 trillion on infrastructure to help low and middle income countries. Anna, how feasible do you think that plan is?
Of course, it's a good plan, and poor and middle-income countries would benefit out of it. And so, kind of good luck with that. We can only wish it every success. The note of caution is, of course, whether they will be able to mobilize these resources across G7 economies, who are themselves, of course, still need to overcome the COVID impact. And also with which speed they're going to move. Because if it will be the US moving first, it will be very much an American initiative. And that would be probably contrary to the consensus within G7. Yeah? European countries are known, and European Union as a body are known to move actually quite slowly. Some viewers might even remember there was a Traseka project by the European Union, which was going to connect China through Central Asia and different routes to Europe. Actually, very little has been built in reality. It was more about feasibility studies and risk assessments and the consultants being deployed in the field, but in terms of actual roads and bridges and tunnels, we haven't seen much of that. But as a kind of common goal, as a slogan, as an aspiration, that's something probably is quite significant. So we should look at it more as a statement of intent, rather than these countries are going to benefit directly in a short-term perspective.
Professor Wang, when you look at this Western-led infrastructure plan, $40 trillion or so was the pledge. Do you think it is a direct counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative? What is driving this Western infrastructure project?
Firstly, I think that China welcome the advanced economy invest more in the infrastructure domestically, and even particularly for the low-income countries, because it's very neat. Secondly, we question about the credibility of that slogan, because even domestic for United States also need lots of money to invest in infrastructure building. They don't have so capacity and even intention to really to do that. Maybe it's lip service. And most importantly, we worry about the U.S. use this slogan is to want to sell the inflation to the world. They print too much U.S. dollars. So they need an excuse of the country of the China's Belt Road Initiative, and then to sell the inflation and print about U.S. dollars and make more troubles and more bubbles in the future. That's the very concern of everybody in the world.
So basically exporting its inflation by printing more dollars to the world and saying that, well, by the way, this is for the betterment of the developing world, for development of middle and lower income countries.
Definitely.
Have we seen this before?
Well, the hot money in the world is hundreds of trillions of US dollars. So that's the reason global financial crisis happened. Now they even want to invest more. If the United States cannot change the patterns of the investment, not just too much to rely on the private, because the infrastructure, you need long-term interest. I also need the industrialization. Now they suffered with the called deindustrialized domestically. How can you rely on the United States, even invest in the other countries' infrastructure. So their experience of the industrialization hundreds of years ago, maybe the standard is too high, they cannot adapt to the local condition of the developing countries. So that's the reason China, the largest developing countries, the 140 countries that joined the Belt Road Initiative, want to share the China's open reform, that they want to reach, build the road, to get the rich quickly build the motor road.
Anna, my final question to you, how successful do you think Joe Biden has been during his G7 leaders summit in rallying his EU allies against China? Are the European countries really on the same page with Washington?
Well, firstly, Joe Biden generally is considered by the G7 leaders as a breath of fresh air. They feel that they can do business with him. So they can somehow enter a constructive dialogue, persuading him, taking his points. So they have a kind of interlocutor, which they didn't feel that they had in Trump. But at the same time, on China, they have different views. They have their own relationship with China. Some countries generally are more pragmatic, more conciliatory. Some have quite a lot of economic and tourist ties, for example, with China, and all sorts of concerns also about security. So they are actually very cautious on that. So there was one moment within G7 that when China was discussed, everybody had to switch off. Internet was switched off completely and everything was shut up, because that was the one most sensitive issue where there was a lot of disagreement and a lot of issues of consensus to be built. So yes, they have arrived to something which they seem to be workable at the moment. How much that kind of consensus would take the test of time, we don't know. We are at the beginning of the road. It was very much kind of Biden plus Anglo-Saxon countries initiative on kind of in one sort of side. In one camp, Britain, Canada, yes, United States, and other G7 members on the other, urging softer approach, more caution, and also leaving the door open.
Exactly.
So
Only time will tell how
a
much has actually been delivered coming out of this summit. Thanks so much, Professor Anna Matveeva of King's College London. That's all the time we have, I'm afraid. And also thank you, Professor Wang Yiwei from Renmin University of China.